A 19-year-old girl walked into a hospital complaining of back pain and walked out in handcuffs for murder. Between those two moments, a newborn was found dead in a bathroom trash can. And the question that haunts everyone who hears this story is simple: what really happened in that locked room? Before we go further, I want you to comment below with the most disturbing psychological question this case raises for you. What part of this story makes you most uncomfortable, and why? January 27, 2023, started as an ordinary winter day in Artesia, New Mexico. The small city, population roughly 12,000, sits in the southeastern corner of the state, surrounded by oil fields and desert landscape. Artesia General Hospital serves as the primary medical facility for the region, a modest building where most residents have been treated at some point in their lives. On that Friday evening, the emergency department was operating with its usual staff, handling the typical mix of injuries, illnesses, and urgent care needs that define small-town medicine. Alexee Trevizo arrived with her mother around 7 in the evening. She was 19 years old, a recent high school graduate still living at home, working part-time jobs, and navigating the uncertain territory between adolescence and adulthood that defines so many young people in rural America. She told the intake nurse she was experiencing severe lower back pain, the kind that made movement difficult and sleep impossible. Her mother stood beside her, concerned but not alarmed. Back pain is common. Back pain brings thousands of people to emergency rooms every day. There was no reason, in that moment, to suspect this visit would be anything other than routine. The triage nurse took Alexee's vital signs and medical history. She answered questions about her symptoms, when the pain started, whether she had experienced anything like this before. She was admitted for evaluation. A doctor examined her, palpating her abdomen, asking about the location and intensity of the pain. Standard protocol for unexplained severe pain includes blood work, and the medical staff drew samples to run a comprehensive panel. Alexee was given a hospital gown and moved to a treatment area to wait for results. What happened next would become the fulcrum on which the entire case would turn. When the blood work came back, a nurse approached Alexee and her mother with results that changed everything. The tests showed elevated levels of human chorionic gonadotropin, the hormone produced during pregnancy. The nurse informed them that Alexee was pregnant. Not just pregnant, but according to the hormone levels and a subsequent examination, in active labor. Try to imagine that moment. You are 19 years old. You came to the hospital for back pain. A nurse tells you that you are pregnant and currently giving birth. Your mother is standing right there. The fluorescent lights are too bright. The hospital sounds too loud. Your entire understanding of your own body, your own life, your own immediate future has just been shattered in a single sentence. Would you have believed it? Would you have accepted it immediately, or would your mind have rejected the information as impossible? The human brain, when confronted with information that contradicts its fundamental understanding of reality, does not always process that information rationally. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that occurs when new information conflicts with existing beliefs. In extreme cases, the mind can simply refuse to accept the new information, creating a psychological barrier that feels as real and solid as a physical wall. Denial is not always a choice. Sometimes it is a reflex, an involuntary psychological defense mechanism that activates when reality becomes too overwhelming to process. Security footage from the hospital, later reviewed by investigators and partially released to the public, shows what happened after the nurse delivered the news. Alexee stood up from the examination table. Her movements were quick, purposeful. She walked toward the nearest restroom, moving with the kind of speed that suggests urgency but not quite panic. Her mother followed part way, then stopped, perhaps uncertain what to do, perhaps giving her daughter a moment of privacy to process the shocking information. The restroom door closed. The lock clicked. For the next 20 minutes, that locked door became the barrier between what the world knew and what only Alexee experienced. Medical staff, growing concerned, knocked repeatedly. They called out, asking if she needed help, if she was okay, if she wanted a nurse to come in. According to their statements to police, Alexee responded briefly, saying she was fine, that she just needed a moment. Her voice, they said, sounded strained but not panicked. She did not scream. She did not call for help. She remained behind that locked door while nurses waited outside, growing increasingly worried. What goes through a person's mind in a moment like that? When your body is doing something you did not know was possible. When pain and fear and confusion merge into a single overwhelming experience. When you are alone in a locked room and the entire trajectory of your life is changing in real time. What thoughts form? What decisions get made? The nurses eventually gained access to the restroom. They found blood. Not an unusual amount for a medical emergency, but enough to confirm that something significant had occurred. They began searching the small space, looking for signs of what had happened, trying to understand what they were dealing with. A hospital employee, conducting a more thorough check, looked inside the trash can. Inside a black plastic bag, they found a newborn. The baby was not moving, not breathing, not crying. Hospital staff immediately initiated emergency protocols. They notified the attending physician. They called security. They contacted the Artesia Police Department. Within minutes, the small hospital room transformed into a crime scene, with medical personnel trying to determine if there was any possibility of resuscitation while simultaneously preserving evidence for the investigation they knew was coming. Alexee was still in the hospital, still in her room, when police arrived. Body camera footage from the responding officers, later released to the public and viewed millions of times online, shows the confrontation that followed. The video is difficult to watch, not because of graphic content, but because of the raw psychological tension it captures. A young woman still in a hospital gown sitting on an examination table surrounded by police officers and medical staff, being told that a baby was found in the bathroom trash can and that she needs to explain what happened. Her response, captured on multiple body cameras from different angles, would become one of the most analyzed and debated pieces of evidence in the case. She said the baby came out with nothing. She said it was not crying. She said it happened so fast. She appeared scared, confused, her eyes moving between the officers and her mother, her hands shaking. She did not louder up immediately. She did not refuse to speak. She answered questions, though her answers were fragmented, incomplete. The words of someone whose mind was still trying to catch up with what her body had just experienced. Do you think she was telling the truth in that moment? Do you think she was lying? Or do you think she was in such a state of shock that the distinction between truth and lie had ceased to have meaning? The police took her into custody. She was not arrested immediately, but she was detained for questioning, transported to the police station while forensic teams processed the hospital. Restroom and medical examiners began their work on the newborn. The investigation that followed would take months, involving medical records, witness interviews, security footage analysis, and forensic pathology reports that attempted to answer the central question: was the baby born alive? That question, simple in its phrasing but impossibly complex in its implications, became the foundation of the criminal charges that would eventually be filed. In New Mexico, as in most states, the legal definition of murder requires that the victim was alive at the time of the act that caused their death. If the baby was stillborn, if it never took a breath, if it was already deceased when it was placed in the trash can, then the legal framework changes entirely. The charges might still be serious, involving improper disposal of human remains or failure to report a death, but they would not be murder. The medical examiner's report, portions of which were made public through court filings, concluded that the baby had been born alive. The determination was based on multiple factors. Lung tissue analysis suggesting the infant had taken at least one breath. The presence of air in the stomach and other physiological markers that forensic pathologists use to distinguish live birth from stillbirth. The report estimated the baby had been at full term, approximately 37 to 40 weeks gestation, and weighed just over 6 pounds. Based on this medical determination, prosecutors in Lee County filed charges against Alexee Trevizo. The charges were severe: first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. First-degree murder, in New Mexico, requires proof of willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing. The prosecution's theory, as outlined in charging documents and preliminary hearings, was that Alexee had given birth to a live infant, then intentionally caused its death by placing it in the trash can, either through suffocation, exposure, or deliberate neglect of a newborn's immediate medical needs. The defense response was immediate and forceful. Alexee's attorneys argued that she had not known she was pregnant, that the labor had come on suddenly and, without warning, that she had been in a state of medical and psychological shock, and that any actions she took in that bathroom were the result of panic and trauma, not criminal intent. They pointed to her age, her lack of prenatal care, and the phenomenon known in medical literature as pregnancy denial or concealed pregnancy. Pregnancy denial is a documented psychological condition in which a woman does not recognize or acknowledge that she is pregnant, sometimes until the moment of labor. It is not the same as hiding a pregnancy from others. It is a genuine psychological state in which the mind does not process or accept the physical reality of pregnancy. Studies suggest it occurs in approximately 1 in 400 to 500 pregnancies, though exact numbers are difficult to determine because many cases are never reported or documented. Women experiencing pregnancy denial often do not show typical pregnancy symptoms, do not gain significant weight, continue to have what they perceive as menstrual periods, and genuinely believe they are not pregnant even when confronted with evidence to the contrary. Could Alexee have been experiencing pregnancy denial? Her defense team argued yes, pointing to the fact that she had continued her normal life, working, socializing, showing no outward signs of pregnancy that her family or friends noticed. They noted that she had gone to the hospital for back pain, not because she suspected she was in labor. They emphasized that her reaction to being told she was pregnant, captured on security footage, showed genuine shock and confusion. The prosecution countered with questions about the timeline. If she truly did not know she was pregnant until that moment in the hospital, why did she immediately go to the bathroom and lock the door? Why did she not call for help during the labor? Why did she place the newborn in a trash can rather than alerting medical staff who were just outside the door? These questions, they argued, suggested consciousness of guilt, an awareness that what she was doing was wrong, and an attempt to hide the evidence. The case became a national story almost immediately. In the age of social media, where body camera footage and court documents can be shared and analyzed by millions within hours, the Alexee Trevizo case became a focal point for debates about reproductive rights, mental health, teenage pregnancy, and the criminal justice system's treatment of young women in crisis. Comment sections filled with opinions, often harsh, often contradictory. Some saw her as a murderer who deserved the maximum penalty. Others saw her as a victim of circumstance, a scared teenager who made a terrible decision in a moment of overwhelming panic. Still others questioned the entire framework of prosecuting women for actions taken during or immediately after childbirth, arguing that such cases reveal more about societal failures than individual criminality. The online discourse, while often lacking nuance, did raise legitimate questions about the case. What support systems had failed that a 19-year-old could go through an entire pregnancy without anyone noticing? What role did shame, fear, or lack of access to healthcare play in her decisions? How should the legal system balance accountability for a death with recognition of the extreme psychological and physical circumstances surrounding that death? Throughout 2023 and into 2024, the case moved through the court system with the slow, grinding pace that characterizes serious criminal proceedings. Preliminary hearings examined the evidence. Expert witnesses testified about pregnancy denial, neonatal physiology, and forensic pathology. The defense filed motions to suppress certain evidence, to reduce the charges, to allow expert testimony about the psychological state of women experiencing concealed pregnancy and sudden labor. The prosecution opposed these motions, arguing that the evidence clearly showed intentional action, not panic or medical emergency. One of the most contentious aspects of the case involved the interpretation of Alexee's statements to police. In the body camera footage, she says the baby came out with nothing, that it was not crying. The prosecution argued this was an admission that she knew the baby was alive but chose not to seek help. The defense argued it was the confused statement of a teenager in shock, trying to process an experience she had no framework to understand. They pointed out that she did not say she killed the baby. She did not confess to any intentional act of harm. She described what happened in fragmented, incomplete terms because that was how she experienced it, as a fragmented, incomplete traumatic event that her mind was still struggling to comprehend. The question of intent became central to the legal arguments. In criminal law, intent is often the difference between murder and manslaughter, between a long prison sentence and a lesser charge. Did Alexee intend to kill the baby, or did she simply fail to act in a way that would have saved its life? Is there a meaningful legal distinction between those two scenarios when the result is the same? Consider this. If you were on the jury, what would you need to know to make that determination? Would you need to understand her mental state in that bathroom? Would you need expert testimony about what happens to the human mind under extreme stress? Would you need to know about her upbringing, her education, her understanding of pregnancy and childbirth? Or would you simply look at the outcome, a dead newborn in a trash can, and decide that regardless of intent or mental state, someone must be held accountable? As the case progressed into 2024, additional details emerged through court filings and media reports. Alexee had no prior criminal record. She had graduated high school, worked at local businesses, and by all accounts lived a relatively normal teenage life in a small New Mexico town. Friends and family members, interviewed by local news outlets, expressed shock and disbelief. They described her as quiet, responsible, not someone they would have expected to be involved in such a case. But then, what does someone who would be involved in such a case look like? What warning signs should people have seen? The defense team brought in experts on adolescent psychology and trauma response. These experts testified about the ways in which the teenage brain, still developing in areas related to impulse control and long-term planning, responds differently to crisis situations than an adult brain. They explained that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making and understanding consequences, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. In moments of extreme stress, teenagers are more likely to make impulsive decisions, to act without fully considering outcomes, to be overwhelmed by immediate emotional responses rather than engaging in logical problem-solving. The prosecution brought in their own experts, who testified that regardless of brain development, a 19-year-old understands that a newborn baby needs immediate medical care and that placing an infant in a trash can will likely result in death. They argued that the defense was trying to excuse criminal behavior by pathologizing normal teenage psychology, and that accepting such arguments would create a dangerous precedent that could be used to excuse any number of crimes committed by young adults. The legal battle over expert testimony, over what evidence would be admissible at trial, over how the jury would be instructed to consider Alexee's age and mental state, consumed months of court time. Each hearing brought new arguments, new motions, new attempts by both sides to shape the narrative that would eventually be presented to a jury. Meanwhile, the public conversation continued to evolve. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to the case, analyzing every piece of available evidence, interviewing legal experts and psychologists, debating the moral and legal questions it raised. YouTube channels created detailed timelines, breaking down the security footage frame by frame, examining Alexee's body language and facial expressions for clues about her mental state. Online forums filled with amateur detectives and armchair psychologists, each convinced they had figured out the truth of what happened in that locked bathroom. The intense public scrutiny created its own set of problems for the legal process. How do you find an impartial jury when millions of people have already formed opinions about the case? How do you ensure a fair trial when every piece of evidence has been dissected and debated online before it is ever presented in court? The defense filed motions for change of venue, arguing that pretrial publicity had made it impossible for Alexee to receive a fair trial in Lee County. The prosecution opposed, arguing that publicity alone is not grounds for moving the trial and that proper jury selection could identify impartial jurors even in a high-profile case. As 2024 turned into 2025, the case remained in pretrial proceedings. Court dates were scheduled, then rescheduled. Both sides continued to prepare, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, consulting with experts. The legal system, designed to be thorough and deliberate, moved at its characteristic pace, seemingly oblivious to the public's desire for resolution and answers. For Alexee, the months of legal limbo meant living under the shadow of first-degree murder charges, facing the possibility of life in prison if convicted. For the prosecution, it meant building a case strong enough to convince 12 jurors, beyond a reasonable doubt, that a scared teenager in a hospital bathroom had committed premeditated murder. For the defense, it meant finding a way to make a jury understand the psychological complexity of what happened in those 20 minutes to see their client not as a monster, but as a young woman who made terrible decisions in the worst moment of her life. The medical community also grappled with questions raised by the case. Should hospital staff have handled the situation differently? When a patient is informed she is in active labor and immediately locks herself in a bathroom, what is the appropriate response? How quickly should staff intervene? What are the legal and ethical obligations of medical personnel in such situations? Artesia General Hospital faced scrutiny over its protocols, though no formal complaints or lawsuits were filed against the facility or its staff. The case also highlighted broader issues in American healthcare and social services. How many young women go through pregnancies without prenatal care because they lack insurance, fear judgment, or do not have access to reproductive health care? What support systems exist for teenagers facing unplanned pregnancies, and are those systems adequate? When a 19-year-old can go through an entire pregnancy without anyone noticing or offering help, what does that say about the communities and institutions that are supposed to support young people? These systemic questions, while important, often got lost in the more sensational aspects of the case. The image of a baby in a trash can is visceral and disturbing, and it tends to overwhelm more nuanced discussions about healthcare access, sex education, mental health services, and the social stigma surrounding teenage pregnancy. But those nuanced discussions are essential to understanding not just what happened in that hospital bathroom, but why it happened and how similar tragedies might be prevented in the future. As the legal process continued, both sides prepared for the possibility of trial. The prosecution organized their evidence into a narrative of intentional harm. A young woman who knew she was pregnant, who gave birth to a live baby, and who made a conscious decision to let that baby die rather than seek help. The defense prepared their counter-narrative. A teenager experiencing pregnancy denial, thrust into sudden labor without warning or preparation, who panicked and made terrible decisions in a state of psychological shock and trauma. Which narrative is true? Perhaps both contain elements of truth. Perhaps the reality is more complex than either side's legal argument can capture. Human behavior, especially in extreme circumstances, rarely fits neatly into the categories that criminal law requires. We want clear answers. Guilty or innocent, intentional or accidental, murder or tragedy. But the human mind, particularly under stress, operates in shades of gray that resist such binary classifications. The question that haunts this case, the question that makes it so disturbing and so compelling, is not really about legal definitions or forensic evidence. It is about understanding how a human being, a teenager who by all accounts was living a normal life, could end up in a situation where a newborn baby died in a hospital bathroom. It is about the gap between what we think we would do in such a situation and what we might actually do if we found ourselves there. It is about the uncomfortable recognition that under the right circumstances, or perhaps the wrong circumstances, any of us might make decisions that seem incomprehensible from the outside. Would you have called for help? Would you have told the nurses what was happening? Would you have been able to think clearly enough to make rational decisions while your body was in labor and your mind was in shock? Or would you, like Alexee, have locked the door and tried to handle it alone, making choices that would haunt you for the rest of your life? The case remains unresolved as of the most recent court updates. No trial date has been set. The legal arguments continue. Alexee Trevizo remains free on bond, living with the knowledge that she may spend the rest of her life in prison for what happened in those 20 minutes. The baby, never named publicly, remains a symbol of all the questions this case raises about responsibility, mental health, societal support systems, and the limits of criminal law in addressing human tragedy. What happened in that locked bathroom at Outrage General Hospital on January 27, 2023, will eventually be decided by a jury. They will hear the evidence, listen to the experts, watch the body camera footage, and make a determination about guilt or innocence. But regardless of their verdict, the deeper questions this case raises will remain unanswered. How do we balance accountability with compassion? How do we punish actions taken in moments of extreme psychological distress? How do we prevent similar tragedies without criminalizing young women in crisis? The Alexee Trevizo case is not just about one teenager and one terrible night in a small-town hospital. It is about all of us, about the society we have created, about the support we offer or fail to young people facing impossible situations. It is about the gap between the legal system's need for clear answers and the messy, complicated reality of human behavior under stress. It is about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes there are no good answers, only difficult questions that force us to examine our own assumptions about guilt, innocence, and what we owe to each other in moments of crisis. And perhaps most disturbingly, it is about the recognition that the line between tragedy and crime, between victim and perpetrator, between someone deserving of help and someone deserving of punishment, is far thinner than we would like to believe.